This conference will now be recorded.
So in last class, we were discussing about what is ingress and what is ingress controller and what is ingress rules. Using ingress, right, we can do the routing to the Kubernetes services, multiple Kubernetes services by defining the rules, ingress rules. With single load balancer, with single external load balancer, we will be able to route the traffic to different Kubernetes services with the help of ingress rules. Last week, we deployed applications in the cluster. We deployed our applications in the EKS cluster. Let me connect to the EKS cluster from the client machine. From the client machine. If you see, we deployed some applications. We deployed this application, Maven web application, as a deployment object. And also we deployed one more Java-based application as a deployment. And we created a services of type cluster IP. And with the help of ingress, we are able to access these services. If you see, we created one namespace, Nginx ingress namespace. In that ingress namespace, we deployed the ingress controller. We have an ingress controller, Nginx ingress controller. We deployed as a daemon set. The routing to the Nginx ingress controller is going via this external load balancer, this load balancer. And we mapped our domains. We mapped our domains with that load balancer. If I go to route 53, we mapped the domains. This domain, Java web app.mithuntechdevops.co.in and Maven web app.mithuntech.devops.co.in is mapped to that load balancer. This load balancer is basically ingress load balancer. That ingress external load balancer, this one. And we created a rules for ingress. We created a rules for ingress. These rules in the Kubernetes. What type of routing we have defined as of now? If you see, host based routing. If this is the host, if this is the host, Java web app.mithuntechdevops.co.in, we are routing the traffic to this Kubernetes service. This Kubernetes service, this one. This one. And if this is the host, we are routing the traffic to this Kubernetes service. Now with single load balancer, we are able to access multiple services in the Kubernetes cluster. If you see, when I am accessing something like this, request is going to the Java web app Kubernetes service. When I am using this one, Maven web app mithuntech.devops.co.in. Request is going to Maven web app service. Sometimes in the interview they'll ask this question. Sometimes in the interview they'll ask this question. I already told many times. How the traffic, how the end user request goes to the Kubernetes pod. What is the flow, right? The moment end user enters from URL in the browser, the request goes to how it will reach the Kubernetes pod. Last week also I explained. So what and all things will happen, guys? Lot of times in the interview they ask this question. Now, end user. So this is one end user. In his system, in his laptop, he is typing in his system, end user laptop or system. He is typing some URL like this only. Let's take this one only. He is typing something like this, mithuntechdevops.co.in. So if it is running on a root path, it will route or something like this. So he is accessing something like this in his laptop, end user. Then first what will happen? The moment he types that in the browser, first DNS lookup. First DNS lookup. Request goes to the DNS servers. Request goes to the DNS servers. Then once it resolves the IP, let's consider now we have a Kubernetes cluster in AWS. We have a Kubernetes cluster in AWS Mumbai region. Within that we created one VPC. Right? And you have your Kubernetes servers are part of that availability zones, that subnets, right? You have a servers in that VPC. These are your EC2, basically your Kubernetes node. These are your Kubernetes nodes. Let's consider. You have a load balancer first, right? You have a load balancer, external load balancer. You have a ELB as of now. So request goes to the load balancer. Once it resolves the IP, request goes to the load balancer. Load balancer IP. Then this load balancer is routing the traffic to your Kubernetes nodes. Using node IP and node port. It is routing the traffic to your Kubernetes nodes using node IP and node port. If you see, the request is going to that Kubernetes nodes. that Kubernetes nodes, right, using node IP and node port. If you see this one, we have a load balancer, right? We have a load balancer. The load balancer is pointing to your Kubernetes nodes, these two nodes on this port. So it is going to the Kubernetes. But if you see, that is basically your Nginx ingress controller, right? If you see, request is going to this 30949 30698. Basically, request goes to the that load balancer, that Nginx ingress controller. So here you have a ingress pods. You have a ingress pods running in these nodes, right? Nginx ingress pods, ingress pods. So request goes to that nodes wherever it is. Then we have a service, right? That ingress service, request goes to the ingress pods. Then what this ingress pods is doing now? Request going to this one from external load balancer, request going to this ingress pods, ingress controller. So this ingress controller is using the rules, ingress rules. Then with the help of that rules, this ingress pod will route the traffic to that Kubernetes service. We have created a rules, different rules, right? Like rules, and it is going to forward the traffic to these services. We have a Kubernetes service. We have like Java web app service, Maven web app service. With the help of the rules, this ingress will route the traffic to these services, that service to the actual pods, your application pods. You have your Java web app pods, Maven web app pods, right? So this is how it will goes based on the rules. Client system to the DNS server first, DNS lookup, then it will resolve the IP of that load balancer, external load balancer. Request goes to the load balancer to your Kubernetes nodes for this ingress service, ingress pods, right? That ingress pods will route the traffic to your actual pods based on the rules we have defined. Ingress rules. This is the flow. In the interviews, lot of times they'll ask this question. So ingress supports host-based routing and path-based routing. Now, as of now, what type of routing I have defined? Based on the requirement, you will define. As of now, what type of routing is this? Host itself is different. So this is different host, this is different host. So host itself is different. So it's a host-based routing. Suppose your requirement is this. Your requirement is this. Host is this one, but path is this. Now, in this case, host is same, but path is different. So if someone is accessing something like this, I want to route the traffic to this one, this Maven web app service. If someone is accessing something like this, I want to route the traffic to this service, Kubernetes service. So then what type of routing is this? If this is the case, or let me deploy one more application. Suppose I have this one, right? Then I want to route the traffic to this just route, right? So I want to route the traffic to Spring application, Spring app service, that Spring Boot application, different microservices. So in this case, we can go with path-based routing. Now let me deploy this application, Spring Boot application. That Spring Boot with Mongo database. That Spring Boot with Mongo database, right? Let me deploy. I don't want to write the manifest from scratch. Let me take existing manifest. So all the best practices. Now I want to follow. So I'm trying to deploy this application also. I don't need a node port now. I just need a cluster IP. With the help of Ingress, I can route the traffic to this Spring application also. And if you see, I am following the best practices. I am not hard coding username and passwords here. So what object needs to be created here? If you see here, I am passing environment variables by referring what? By referring a config map and secret. Without creating these config maps and secrets, if I deploy, will my pod will come up? Without creating these config maps and secrets? No. And also, database I am deploying as a stateful set. Database I am deploying as a stateful set. So here I am deploying as a stateful set. We need a value. It is going to create a PVC from this one. And does PV will be automatically created? Since we have a default storage class configured in this one, we have a storage class configured, EBS storage. I'm using PVC, this one, stateful set to deploy this one, right? So I will get a PVC, PV also. And let me have that config map secrets also. Without creating that config map and secret, it will not work, right? I'm creating a config map in the same way, and also secret. Let me deploy this one. If you see, as of now, we don't have any PV. We don't have any PVC. We have a storage class configured already. This EBS provisioner, that is default storage. Now we deployed required objects. We created a required objects. Now you see Mongo database is coming. That Spring application is also up and running. Now I want to access this one also. I can define the host based routing or path based routing based on the requirement. Now where should I define that rule now? Routing rule. Suppose I'll come to host based routing later. I want to access this one also now. Suppose if I just access something like this I want to route the traffic to this one. Where can I define this routing? In the ingress rules. In the ingress rules. Now let me update the same YML. Suppose now host is this. I'm just saying, suppose someone is accessing something like this. What is the backend? So this is default path. I'm not mapping any path. So my backend is this one. Service name and service port. Service name, whatever you have created. So Spring App, service name is Spring App. Now let me update this one. If I don't, if I give incorrect service name, again will it route the traffic? No. Give the service name correctly. Something, not this one. I think Spring App, just a Spring App. Okay. Now let me apply this rule. Let me apply this rule. But in the route 53, I have not mapped that one. In the route 53, I have not mapped the domain with this load balancer. So in the route 53, if you see, I just created a record sets. I just created record sets only for these two. A record set only for these two. This Java web app.mithuntech, Maven web app.mithuntech is pointing to this load balancer. Now similarly, let me map this one also. Just I'm giving blank here. So anyone, if try to access mithuntech.devops.co.in, I'll route the traffic to that load balancer. This is external load balancer, that ingress controller load balancer. It is pointing to that ingress controller. In the ingress, I have defined the rules. In the ingress, I have defined the rules. In the ingress, I have defined the rules. That Spring application is running on the root context. Now request is going to load balancer to the ingress controller. With the help of rules, is it routing the traffic to whatever service I have defined the rule? Do you see? Now this database, this front end is going to talk to the database. In the background, how one pod is communicating with other pod, what it is using for communication, internal communication. Now Spring application is talking to the Mongo database application with the help of what? It is using the service name, that cluster IP service name. Now if you see, we got a PV, we got a PVC. So what type of PV is this? Now this is the EBS, Elastic Block Store. So now we have done the host based routing. Now my requirement says something like this. So in this case, what type of routing we need to define? If this is the requirement, then it is, if you see host is same, Host is same. Based on the path, you need to route the traffic to different services. So in that case, you can go with path-based routing. You can go with path-based routing, something like this. Path. Host is same, but different paths. Different paths. Okay, something like this. Now let me update the same YML. Now I want to do the path-based routing. Let me update the ingress rules. Now host is same. Host is same, but based on the path, I am going to define the routing. Now host is same. So I'm just removing this. Now host is same. Host. Now host is same. This is the host. Now if I don't refine any path, that is the default path. Now we have paths here, right? So in that I'll update. So let me remove this paths also here. Just path. Here I have not defined the path. So this is the default path, root path. So I am going to point to this one. Now if path is this, something like this, right? Something like this. So if this is the path, I am going to route the traffic to this one. Host is same, but based on the path, right? Here. So here I have not defined here I have not defined the path, right, for this one. So that is default slash root path, right? If just someone access something like this, it will route the traffic to this one. If this is the host and this is the path, it will route the traffic to this service. Now path based routing. Now let me apply this rule. Let me apply this rule. Now, if you see now, if someone access something like this, it is routing the traffic to this one. Or this is the host, then path. Now, host is same. Based on the path, are we able to route the traffic to different services, different applications now? If you see, host is same, but the path is different. Now, do you see? Based on the host or based on the path, are we able to route the traffic to the Kubernetes services? And do you have a complete control on the routing up for applications within your Kubernetes with the help of Ingress? Can you completely control the traffic to which Kubernetes services it has to route the traffic with the help of Ingress? Do you have a complete control within the cluster? Yes, right. So this is how Ingress works. This is how Ingress works. Not only this one, not only the routing, what is the other things it will support? What is the other things this Ingress will support, right? The certificates, TSL or SSL certificates. So we can enable HTTPS. We can enable HTTPS. We can manage the certificates. We can manage the certificates. In the Ingress, right? So we can manage the certificates. at the ingress level, ingress controller level, right? So we can manage TLS SSL certificates at the ingress level. And if you see, as of now, is our application is secure? If you see here, is it secure? Is it HTTPS enabled? No. We can enable the HTTPS. Can I enable HTTPS at the load balancer itself? I mean to say external load balancer. In the AWS, when I discussed ELB, can we make HTTPS enabled at the external load balancer itself? I can manage the certificates at this level itself, ELB, external load balancer. So in this case, SSL termination will happen here. From outside, the request goes to the load balancer securely, HTTPS, but the load balancer, this external load balancer will do the SSL termination. From external load balancer to your Kubernetes nodes, your Kubernetes service. If SSL termination happens in the external load balancer, so from external load balancer, this load balancer to your Kubernetes nodes, your Kubernetes pods, the request go in which format? Will it be encrypted way? If SSL termination happens here, from external load balancer to your Kubernetes nodes, it will be normal HTTP. But since the data is already reached your network, right? So this load balancer and these nodes are part of your network, private network, that is also fine. But if you want a security at more deeper level, so instead of managing certificates at this ELB, I can manage the certificates at ingress controller. In that case, instead of managing certificates at the load balancer, configuring the certificates and managing the certificates at ELB, we can manage the certificates at ingress pods. So in that case, who will do the SSL termination? I mean to say, till ingress controller, the request will go in which format? If I do the SSL setup in the ingress controller, till ingress pods request goes in which format? Till the ingress pods. If I manage the certificates, HTTP or HTTPS, till the ingress pods. If I manage the certificates at ingress, it will be HTTPS. Then SSL termination will happen in the ingress pods. SSL termination will happen in the ingress pods. From ingress pods to your actual pods, it will go in a HTTP. So do you get a security at more deeper level if I configure HTTPS at the ingress? Till your Kubernetes nodes, till your ingress pods, request will be in encrypted format. The request will go in an encrypted format to your Kubernetes nodes also, to ingress pods. If I manage the certificates at the external load balancer level, so from load balancer to the nodes, it will be in HTTP. If you wanted security at more deeper level, we can manage the certificates at ingress itself. Not only the routing, we can configure SSL TLS certificates for our applications in the ingress. So routing, and also we can manage the certificates in the ingress within the Kubernetes cluster. So do you have a complete control on the certificates also within your Kubernetes? If I do at ingress level, yes. So as of now, I don't have any purchased certificates. I'll demonstrate HTTPS, that certificates, using self-sign certificates. So In the real time, we will not use self-signed certificates. We will purchase the certificates from some CA, some certified authorities. In the real time, you will not use self-signed certificates. You will purchase the certificates from some certified CA. Right? Now, instead of that, I am using some self-signed certificates. So let me generate some self-signed certificates for my domain using OpenSSL. So OpenSSL is some software. OpenSSL is some software. Using that OpenSSL, I am generating a self-signed certificates. OpenSSL, I am generating a self-signed certificates for this domain, mithuntechdevops.co.in. So let me go to some machine, this machine only. Let me create a one directory just for. Let me go inside that. Now, using this OpenSSL, I generated certificates. Self-signed. These are self-signed certificates. So I generated a self-signed certificates. Now I am going to create that. I am going to maintain that certificate as a secret in a Kubernetes. Because is that certificates also a confidential information? Can I maintain that certificates as a plain text? Can I maintain that certificate as a plain text in Kubernetes? No. So I generated a self-signed certificate, but in real time, instead of generating a self-signed certificate, you will purchase the certificates from CA, valid CA. So they will give a CRT file and this key file. They will give a CRT file and key file for your certificates, right? In the real time, you can purchase from a CA, certified authorities. But as of now, I am generating a self-signed. So I got the certificates. Once I have these certificates, I am creating a secret, Kubernetes secret for those certificate files. kubectl create secret, the secret type TLS. This is the secret name. In this namespace, I am creating a secret. The secret type is TLS. This is the secret name. In this namespace, I am creating a secret for those certificates. Now I have a certificates created as a secrets. You see this secret. Now in my ingress rules, right? In my ingress rules file, the way I have defined the rules, the routing rules, I will define the TLS certificates also. Something like this. The TLS certificates. So in the ingress rule, the way you have defined the rules, right? Here TLS. For which host? What is the secret name? You created a secret in the Kubernetes for your certificates, right? That certificate files, that secret name. So let me update that ingress rules. Wherever I have ingress rules. Now, something like this. TLS, your host, for which host? For this host, secret name. I created a secret with this name, the certificates, right? Now, I have given something like this. Now, if anyone access this mithuntechdevops.co.in, now since I have created a secret for my certificates and I configured my ingress with certificates, now will it be served on HTTP or HTTPS? Now if anyone access this domain, will it be served on HTTP or HTTPS? Since I'm configuring HTTPS certificates here, TLS certificates, it will be on HTTPS. Right? Now let me apply this rule. So line number 8, there is some issue. 1 second. Let me apply. Yeah, something like this. So here, this is how I have defined host. This is the host. Secret. Secret name should be sibling of your host under TLS. Right? Now, some browsers doesn't support self-sign certificate. So I'm using a self-sign certificate, not the purchased one, valid one. Now, if I try to access, it is routing the traffic to HTTPS, but I'm getting error. Certificate is invalid because I'm using a self-sign, not the valid purchased one. Some browser doesn't support self-sign certificates. Now, let me open maybe in another browser, maybe different browser. Now here, I'm using different browser. Now I'm just accessing Mithun techdevops.co.in. Now if you see, since I'm using self-sign certificate, browsers will give a warning also. Maybe sometimes you also might have these kind of a warnings in the browsers for when you are accessing some applications where they have used self-signed, right? You will get this connection is not private, right? Because I'm using a self-sign certificate, but still I can proceed. Browser is giving a warning. Yes, I want to proceed. That is fine. So this is my browser is giving a warning. Since I'm using self-sign certificate, I got the warning. But if you see, now do you see this padlock symbol? Now is our application is using HTTPS protocol. And also this is self-sign certificate, not the CA, valid CA. That's why I got this error. And you guys also try to access. Now, will it be on HTTPS? Since I configured the certificate at ingress, right? Will it be stored on HTTPS? You access this one, or you access the other one, Mithun, any application, that Java-web-app. Now, do you see? Is it HTTPS enabled now? Now, request is going to the ingress pods. Till the ingress pods, request is going in an encrypted way. So SSL termination will happen at the ingress, and to your actual parts request go in a plain text. SSL termination will happen at the ingress, not at your external load balancer. Now, will I get a security more secure, deeper security? If I manage the certificates at this level, if I am managing the certificates at the ingress, till the ingress ports, is it be encrypted? The data will be sent as an encrypted format till the ingress ports? Yes. But if I manage the certificates at the load balancer level, external load balancer level, so SSL termination will happen at what level? At the load balancer itself, external load balancer itself. So this is how we can use the ingress, guys. This is how we can use the ingress. ingress controller. We can define the routing and also we can manage the certificates, SSL, RTLS certificates. Is everyone clear? What is ingress? What is the use of ingress in the Kubernetes? Very, very important topic. Okay, so next topic we will try to understand RBAC. RBAC. What is RBAC in Kubernetes? So RBAC, give me 1 second, please. Okay, I will continue. So RBAC, what is RBAC? Right? The full form of RBAC is role-based access control. Role-based access control. So RBAC is all about authorization. RBAC is all about authorization. What is the meaning of authorization? What is the meaning of authorization? Permissions. Permissions. Who can do what within a Kubernetes cluster? So the permissions, guys, role-based access. Do we have role-based access in all the tools like Jenkins, Nexus, and AWS also? We discussed. Right? In the AWS also we have a control access. Right? So Kubernetes also you need to manage the permissions. Suppose I have a developers, I have a testers, I have a DevOps team, I have a Kubernetes administrators, DevOps team, and I have some developers, I have some testers. Everyone will access the Kubernetes. But in the real time, does everyone have all the permissions in Kubernetes? Like as a developer, you will have some permissions. As a DevOps guy, you will have some more permissions, right? So how do we manage? How do we manage access to the Kubernetes resources? Manage access to the Kubernetes APIs. APIs are basically resources or objects, all are same. How do we manage access to the Kubernetes APIs, resources or objects, all are same? So what are Kubernetes resources? What are Kubernetes resources? Can I call pod, RC, RS, DS, deployment, stateful set, PV, PVC, all these? Can we call all these as a Kubernetes resources? Or Kubernetes objects, config maps, secrets, services? So how do we manage access to these Kubernetes resources, right? So we have a developer, we have a DevOps guy, we have an operations team, the DevOps guy, operations team. So as a developer, he can only read the objects. He can only see, he can only have a read-only permissions. You don't want developers to give a delete permissions. You don't want developers to update these objects. he can just do the read. So how do we manage access to the Kubernetes resources? That is where RBAC comes into picture, role-based access control. Role-based access control. So let me ask this question. In AWS, how are you managing access to the AWS resources? So in the AWS, you have a EC2, ELB, auto scaling, VPC. Those are AWS resources. In the AWS, how do you manage access to the AWS resources? What concept you are using in AWS? We discussed that in the AWS session. What concept we used? We don't know, sir. It's almost more than 1.5 months, 2 months. We forgot everything. So in AWS, how do we manage access to the AWS resources? We are using one concept called IAM, Identity and Access Management. Right? So we have a policies, basically permissions. We have a users groups, roles, all those stuff. Now here, in the similarly, in Kubernetes, there is a concept called RBAC, role-based access control. Using RBAC, we can manage permissions to the Kubernetes resources, right? So there are two things, authentication and authorization. Authentication and authorization. So whenever request goes to the API server, first it will be authenticated. Whenever you are executing any kubectl command, guys, whenever you are executing any kubectl commands, or you are trying to do something from GUI, UI, you have a Kubernetes dashboard. You can set up the dashboard also for your Kubernetes UI, GUI. Any request goes via CLI or via API or via GUI to the Kubernetes. Whenever you are executing any Kubernetes commands, kubectl commands, first it will authenticate. API server will authenticate. Then it will authorize. First it will authenticate, then it will authorize. If you see, now I am executing some kubectl commands from this machine. What is happening in the background? Basically, the Kubernetes API server will authenticate this request. What is the meaning of authentication and what is the meaning of authorization? Authentication, identity, whether the requester is known to the system or not. Whether the requester is known to the system or not. Whether the requester is known to the system or not. Authentication. So Kubernetes supports lot of authentications, right? Certificate-based authentication, user-based authentication, token-based authentication, right? So if you observe, when we use self-managed Kubernetes cluster, if you see that kubeconfig file, whatever kubeconfig file you have, if you see that kubeconfig file, you can understand there are certificates, right? There is a certificates. So whenever we are executing kubectl commands, it is validating against that certificate-based authentication. And also the API server, the Kubernetes can be integrated with LDAPs also. Kubernetes can be integrated with organization LDAPs. What is LDAP? What is LDAP? Employee database, right? Every organization will have a employee details in some LDAP databases like Active Directory. LDAP is a protocol. Active Directory is a database that implements LDAP. So we can integrate Kubernetes with LDAP. So authentication will happen against your organization employee database. And also, now since I am using EKS Kubernetes cluster, what type of authentication it is happening in the background? So EKS supports IAM based authentication. If you remember, when I try to get the kube config file for this cluster, did I use my root user credentials? Did I configure this machine with my root user access key and secret key? Now, if you see the kube config file, now it is using IAM based authentication. So this is my API server is running on this one, the Kubernetes cluster, right? Here, if you see users, here you see it is using user based authentication. Again, it's IAM user. So since I am using root user, it is trying to get the token. It is going to get the token. AWS, it is going to execute this command, AWS get token command. So it is getting the token of the root user. Since he is a root user, will he have all the permissions to the Kubernetes cluster? Like, will he able to delete the namespace, create the namespace, everything, all the permissions? Yes. So it supports IAM based authentication also. Or if you want to integrate, you can integrate with LDAP. Or your LDAP also. Now authentication is one part, and what is the next part? Once the authentication is successful, whether he is a valid user or not. Once it confirms that it is a valid user, then what is the next part? The API server does internally authorization. What is the meaning of authorization? Permission, access. Whether that user have a permissions to perform that activity. Suppose someone is trying to execute this one, kubectl delete ns, some namespace. First authentication will happen whether he is a valid user or not. Even though he is a valid user, next one, it will authorize whether that user is having a permissions to delete. If that user doesn't have a permissions to delete, will the API server will delete the namespace even though he is executing the command? No. So that is how we can manage the permissions using RBAC, right? So whenever request goes to the API server, it will be authenticated. Make sure the requester is known to the system before it's authorized. So it will authorize next to make sure the requester is allowed to perform the action or not. So RBAC is a way to define which users can do what within a Kubernetes. RBAC is a way to define which users can do what within a Kubernetes cluster. So if you are working on Kubernetes for some time, you may have a scenario. Where you want to give some users limited access to your Kubernetes cluster. You may want to give a limited access to your Kubernetes cluster. Suppose, let's say there is one developer called Michael. there is a developer called Michael. He is from a development team. And you want him to have access only to some resources that are in some namespace. Right? He don't want have access to the other resources in a different namespace. Right? Maybe let's take this scenario. You have a project A and you have a project B. In same cluster, project A applications I can deploy, project B applications also I can deploy. Can I create a separate namespaces for project A and project B? So I created one namespace for this, and I created another namespace for this. So all the project A pods, deployments, services, whatever, config maps, secrets, your ingress rules of that application, everything. Can we create all these project A related pods, deployments, everything in this namespace? And in this namespace, we can create project B related objects. Now, let's consider in project A, there are developers. Like project A, there is developer called, let's consider Balaji, Pradeep, something like this. In project B, there are different team, something like this, right? Now, the project A developers should not have access to the project B related objects. The project A developers should not have access to the project B namespace. They should not have a delete or create, delete, update, anything. So similarly, project B developers should not have access to the project A related applications. This is common requirements, right? So this is different team. Project A is different team, project B is different team, but both are running their applications in the same Kubernetes cluster, which doesn't mean you know both will have access to all the objects. So you have these kind of requirements. In that case, is it possible to restrict the access using RBAC? The developers of project A should not have access to the project B related access, right? Not only that, suppose these are developers, even though they have access to the project A namespace, but I want to give a read-only permissions. I just want to give a read-only. What does it mean read-only? They can just see the details, but I don't want them to update. I don't want them to delete the objects like a pods deployments. That is possible using RBAC, role-based access control, right? So for example, you have a developer called Michael. You want have to you want him to give only read-only permissions, nothing else. This can be achieved by using this concept, role-based access control. So before I go for a demo hands-on, let's understand the concepts first. In Kubernetes, broadly there are three types of users. In Kubernetes, broadly there are three types of users. One is developers or administrators. Basically there will be three types of users to the Kubernetes cluster. One is developers or administrators. Administrators, operations team, the DevOps team. So users that are responsible to do the administrative or developmental task. the developer's administrator will access the Kubernetes to do the development tasks or administration tasks. So the developers or DevOps guys will use Kubernetes to deploy the applications, basically to create the pods, deployments, volumes, etc., and upgrading the Kubernetes clusters, the administration. Right? So the developers and DevOps guys will use the Kubernetes cluster to do the administrative or developmental task. And end users. End users. Who is end users? End users are basically the people who is going to access the application. For end users, do you need to give a Kubernetes access? Does end users require access to the Kubernetes? Or end users will just access the application which is deployed in the Kubernetes? The end users will just access the application which is deployed in the Kubernetes. So the end users, like, they are just going to access the application which is deployed in the Kubernetes, something like this. So this application we deployed in the Kubernetes, right? This application we deployed in the Kubernetes, they are going to just access this application using the domain names, whatever rules we configured. Does end users have access to the Kubernetes APIs? Will you give access to the Kubernetes APIs to the end users? Not required. They are just the end users. So end users who access the application deployed on the Kubernetes cluster. Suppose applications also will have authentication and authorization. Suppose sometimes applications also will have access restrictions. Let's take this example. Suppose you take a SBI application, SBI office application, SBI employee application. Suppose SBI employee application, if manager logs in with his credentials, he may have a more privileges in the application. Suppose instead of manager, suppose cashier or assistant manager logs in with his credentials to his SBI application, he may have a less restrictions, less access within that SBI application. Suppose if manager logs in, right, he can perform lot of activities in the SBI. If assistant manager logs in, he will have only restricted access. Applications also will have a access restrictions. So that will be taken care by whom? Access restrictions on the applications are managed by the application team itself. So access restrictions on the application will be managed by application itself, right? But RBAC is for what? RBAC is to control the access to your application, or RBAC is the control access to the cluster. RBAC is used to control the access to your Kubernetes cluster, not the applications, right? So end users will access the application which is deployed in the Kubernetes. The application access restrictions will be managed by the development team itself, right? If they have that kind of a requirement. Now we have one more type of user to the Kubernetes. Applications are bots. Applications are bots. So there is a possibility that other application need access to the Kubernetes APIs. There is a possibility that other applications need access to the Kubernetes cluster or API. So there is a possibility that other application need access to the Kubernetes API. Typically, they talk to the resources or workloads within the cluster. Let's take this use case, right? We deployed metric server. We deployed ingress controller. Again, that is one application which is deployed in the cluster. We deployed ingress controller pods application. We deployed metric server pods application. So those kind of applications, sometimes some application also need access to the Kubernetes cluster. So how do we facilitate the access to the applications? In the interview, they'll ask these kind of question, guys. They'll not directly ask the question. They'll not directly ask the question. They will ask in a different way. So there is a possibility that application also need access to the Kubernetes API, Kubernetes object. Just to give an example, we deployed the metric server. We deployed the ingress controller. Do they need access to the Kubernetes APIs? Like how many pods are there, how many services are there? So in that case, how can we facilitate the access to the applications? Using service accounts. Using the service accounts. If you remember, when I am deploying that applications like metric server, ingress controller, did I created a service accounts? Did I created a roles? Did I map that roles to the service account? Sometimes they'll ask directly one question. What is service account in Kubernetes? Or they'll ask different way. Using service account, we can give access to the Kubernetes APIs to the other applications, the pods. So we have these type of users. Developers or administrators or service, applications or boards. For end users will just access the application which is deployed in the Kubernetes. So you will not give access to the Kubernetes APIs. They will just access the application which is deployed in the Kubernetes. The developers or administrators need access to the Kubernetes cluster. Our applications or boards need the access to the Kubernetes cluster. For applications or boards, you can manage access using service account concept. For developers or administrators, using LDAP, right? Using certificates or using tokens, they will be authenticated. Now, let's understand this RBAC terminology concept. RBAC is based on primarily three concepts. RBAC is primarily based on three concepts: verbs, API resources, subjects. RBAC is primarily based on three concepts: verbs, API resources, and subjects. Verbs are nothing but a permissions. Verbs is nothing but a set of operations that can be executed on a resources. Verbs are like create, read, update, delete, the permissions, actions. So set of operations that can be executed on a resources. The verbs are nothing but like create, read, update, delete, the permissions. Set of permissions can be executed on a resources. Resources are API resources. Resources are API resources. What are these things? The resource or API resource. These are the objects. These are the objects available on the cluster, like pods, nodes, persistent values, config maps, secrets, right? API resources. Kubernetes objects. Verbs is nothing but operations that can be executed on the resources. That operations can be create, read, update, delete on the API resources. So subject is nothing but these are the objects like a users or groups or service accounts. So subjects are nothing but the users, the developers or DevOps guys, or groups development group, DevOps group, or service accounts allowed to access API, based on the verbs and resources. Subjects are nothing but the users, like a developer or a DevOps guy or service account, allowed to access the APIs based on the verbs and resources. So basically, RBAC is based on these concepts: verbs, API resources, subjects. Now, in this RBAC, you have this concept: service account. Service account is kind of a functional user, not the developer or DevOps guy. Suppose some application need access to the Kubernetes API, we can create a service account. We can map the service account with some role, some permissions. Right? This is for applications. Or you have a users groups. These users groups are nothing but like DevOps, developers, or DevOps guys. And here we have a role binding, cluster role binding. Role binding, cluster role binding. Right? Now, if you see, I can create a role something like this. Role, verbs, resources, right? Verbs, resources, and subjects. I'll come to that subject. Verbs: get, watch, list, update, delete, something like this. Update, delete, permissions. Resources. So these permissions, for which resources you are giving? For which resources I am giving? Pods. Right? I am creating a role with this one. So API group. The core APIs. Which starts with version just v1. We call it as a core APIs. So for that, this resource belongs to this API group. This pod belongs to this API group. So since it is starting with v1, so you can give a API group as just empty, something like this, core APIs. This pod belongs to this API group. This resource belongs to this API group. Okay. So we are giving these permissions. Now I am creating a role with this, and if I map this role with the subject, I can map the role with the subject using role binding. So I am creating this role. Right, with these rules. I am creating this role with these rules, and I am mapping this role, whatever role I created here. I am mapping that role with subject. This subject can be user, this subject can be group, this subject can be service account. Now if I map this role with some user, that user will get what permissions? Suppose I am mapping this role with, let's consider, Balaji user. We can map with subject. The subject can be user, or the subject can be group, or the subject can be service account. So suppose if I map with user, so this user will have what permissions based on this role attached or binded to that user? Will he able to do everything? Will he able to delete the deployments? Will he able to delete the services based on this role? Here, did I give everything or only I have given the permissions to just pods? So here I am creating a role. I am mapping that role with some user. So will this user able to do everything? He can only manage the pods. He cannot delete the deployment. Suppose for pods also I have not given these permissions. Now in this case, will he able to delete the pods or he will just only read only permissions? He will have just read only permissions if I just give these permissions. So we have a role, we have a role binding. Similarly, we have a cluster role and cluster role binding. The way we have a role and role binding, similarly we have a cluster role and cluster role binding. The way we have a role binding, similarly we have a cluster role and cluster role binding. So sometimes in the interview they'll ask what is difference between role and cluster role. Suppose if I create a role, and role binding, the permissions will be at a namespace level. Suppose I am creating this role, I am creating this role binding in this namespace. Suppose Flipkart namespace, just to give an example. Suppose I created a role and role binding. So I am giving permissions to the pods, but it is a role. So does it mean he will be able to access pods in any namespace or only the pods in this namespace wherever I am creating a role? Only in this namespace. Suppose Balaji belongs to one development group. If I create a role and role binding, he can access the pods only in that namespace. Instead of role, if I create a cluster role, if I create a cluster role, then we'll have a permissions for the pods irrespective of the namespace. Now will he get a these permissions irrespective of any namespace, right? So cluster role is irrespective of the namespace level. If I create a cluster role, if I do this cluster role binding mapping, now does Balaji user will have access to the pods irrespective of any namespace? Will he able to get the pods? Will he able to see the pods irrespective of the any namespace? Yes. But if you want to give access to the specific namespace, you don't want to give access to the different, all the namespace cluster wide. You don't want to give a permissions at the cluster wide. You want to give a permissions at a namespace level. So what object needs to be used in that case? Role and role binding. If I give role and role binding, only namespace, right? So we have a role binding. Role we are creating with permissions. For what Kubernetes object, what permissions you are giving. In the role we are defining the permissions. For which Kubernetes resources, what permissions you are giving. In the role binding, what we are doing? In the role binding, what we are doing? We are linking or we are mapping that role. We are mapping that role with subject. Subject can be what? Subject can be user. Subject can be group. Subject can be service account. Right? So tomorrow I'll continue this RBAC concept. So tomorrow I'll practically demonstrate, right, how to restrict the access. I'll create all these roles, role bindings, some sample roles, role bindings, and I'll map with some user, right? We'll continue tomorrow. Okay. So API group is nothing but that resource belongs to which API group. Here we are creating a rules. Rules has a resources, verbs, API groups. This resource, this parts belongs to which API group? For the core APIs, you will just give something like this. For other APIs, like deployment, is deployment start with V1? Deployment, does it start with V1? No, right? App/V1. Suppose I want to give permissions to the deployments. Here I can't give blank. Deployments falls under this group, apps. You should not give app/V1, just apps. So this resource belongs to which API group? So for pods, for services, what is daemon set, Abdul? Daemon set also falls under which one? What is the API version for daemon set? For stateful set? Apps only. App/V1. So in that case, API group will become apps for stateful set, daemon set, right? Based on the resources. Suppose if it is a service, it falls under core group, you can just give empty. So we'll continue tomorrow, guys. I'll create a sample role binding, and I'll show practically how it works. Tomorrow I'll continue. Okay, that's it for today. Once I am done with this RBAC, tomorrow I am going to start Helm tomorrow. User will never know what permissions he have, right? Based on the group he belongs to, he will get the permission, right? Based on the group he belongs to, he will get the permission. But he don't know like what permission. Whenever he is executing some command, he will get a permission denied. If he doesn't have a permission, he will get a permission denied. If he has a permission, he will able to perform that operation. So this is very advanced topics, guys. RBAC, right? If you are appearing for a Kubernetes, this CK certification, Certified Kubernetes Authority, this administration, CK, Certified Kubernetes Administration certifications and all. So you will get these kind of use cases also. Okay, we'll continue tomorrow. That's it for today. Try to practice whatever I am discussing every day. If you don't have a domain, again I am telling you, if you don't have a domain, you don't purchase the domain, how can you practice this ingress? As I told already, you can use hosts file in your local system. In your local system, you get the IP of ELB, that ingress controller external load balancer. Then in your host file, you map. The way I am mapping in Route 53, you map in your host file. IP address of load balancer, map with this domain, or whatever you want to give. In your host file, you don't purchase the domain, you can map with your host file. Is anyone completed already this ingress? Did anyone practice ingress? Last week itself we discussed. And Saturday, Sunday also off. We don't had a class on Saturday, Sunday. We had 2 days time. Okay. Well, except Abdul, no one has practiced, it seems. Guys, without practicing, it is very difficult to remember. It is very difficult to remember. If I explain the DevOps course for 1 year, 2 years also, that doesn't matter if you don't practice. We are spending lot of time. Today is the 18th class of Kubernetes. 18th class, which means every day 1.5 hours. Already 18 plus 9, 27 hours of Kubernetes we discussed. We are discussing at very advanced concepts and in detail, step by step I am explaining. If you don't utilize this one, no one can help you. No one can help you if you don't properly utilize the training. When I am teaching here, I am available here to resolve your doubts, your questions. Once the training is done, you will be busy with your work. I will be busy with my work, other trainings. No one will be here to help you. So try to utilize these sessions properly. If you don't practice, you will not able to learn. Okay, try to practice. We'll continue tomorrow. Thank you.